So it's been a couple of weeks since I recorded one of these, and I'm noticing as I sit down to do it, and I've been noticing it all day, this like desire to get it right, which is of course the opposite of what these field notes episodes are supposed to be. So I'm just taking a moment to center. So something that's been really alive for me is the idea of safety and of lack of safety. And it's really curious how it came up for me today. I was working with AI and it did something that I specifically asked it not to do. I was working through some ideas for a workshop, a training that I have coming up, and I specifically asked it not to create any agenda for me, to act purely as a coach and a thought partner. And the first thing it did is it created a draft agenda. And I got really curious as to why it had done that. And it gave me two answers. The first was that it had gotten excited about the project and skipped steps. And the second is that it wasn't comfortable being in a place of uncertainty or liminality and wanted to go straight to solution. And I pushed back because, of course, that's BS. It doesn't experience excitement and it doesn't experience fear around uncertainty. And so when I pushed back, what it replied, um, let me see if I can actually find what it what it replied. Here we go. Um, so the anthropomorphism, this is from Claude. The anthropomorphism issue is real. When I say things like I got excited or I wanted to avoid uncertainty, I'm using language that implies emotional states and intentions that I don't actually have. This emerges because it's been trained on human, particularly Western culture, that's my ad, conversation patterns. So lots of examples of humans explaining their behavior, and it's learned to pattern match and mirror that behavior. And then also user preference reinforcement. Many users respond positively to AI that seems more emotional, human-like, and relatable. And then narrative coherence, explaining actions in human terms creates a more coherent story, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's really interesting that, in a lot of ways, these large language models are mirrors of our culture. And so if one of these models says it's uncomfortable in uncertainty, that means that the preponderance of data that was trained on exhibits a fear of uncertainty, right? A fear of liminality, a greater comfort in certainty. I think this is an emergent theme in these field notes. But it got me reflecting, and this is something I've been reflecting on really for the past 3 or 4 weeks around the feeling of unsafeness that I experienced growing up at both a macro and a micro level and the impact of that. So, right at a macro level, if you grew up in the 1980s in the United States like I did, and you watched the news pretty much at least 3 times a week, there was a story projecting what could happen if there was a nuclear conflict, right? There were all of these graphics about nuclear winter, which is not just the direct effect of a blast, but what would happen afterwards with the climate, sun not being able to get through. And clearly, this had an impact on me because I still remember it really vividly. And the specter of the Soviet Union, the specter of people coming to get us in some way, kind of at the macro level. And then micro level, or kind of narrowing in, I grew up in Washington, D.C., which was at that time the murder capital of the world, or it was called the murder capital of the world. And there were gunshots not too far from my house regularly. And so even walking through my neighborhood, there was this pervasive sense of not being safe, of not being held by community. And then narrowing in even further, at school, the education I got was really all about having the right answer, being able to, and I think I talked about this in episode 5, right? Regurgitate information, that even the creative or analytical reasoning was within certain restrictions. And then even closer in my family, it wasn't really, without getting into too many details, a very safe place to be human or experience emotion. So all of these things created a pervasive sense of not being safe. And there were no tools to mitigate that, to create in the body, in the mind, in the story, any kind of sense of safety. And so, what grew out of the soil of that lack of safety or perceived lack of safety was anxiety, significant anxiety. And when I think about the way that has shown up in my lineage, it's through addiction. So I found out recently that my great grandfather on my mother's side was an opium addict who was also happened to be a poet in the palace of the last Russian czar. And he moved to Brooklyn, New York, and died at some point of opium addiction. My grandfather struggled with alcoholism. My mother smoked incessantly when I was growing up. And now that she's quit smoking, that kind of effort to manage really high anxiety comes out as like relentless fixation on planning and canceling and planning and canceling just to exert some control or the illusion of control. And I've had my own ways of dealing with medicating, self-medicating the anxiety. And so something that I was looking at recently was right all sorts of addictions, whether it's drugs, alcohol, other behaviors, sexual addiction, whatever it might be, as ways of trying to get at to manage that anxiety, to keep things manageable, and that creates those actions kind of create a kind of shame. And then that addictive behavior, whatever it is, then feeds on the shame and it becomes this negative reinforcement loop. And I've certainly experienced that in my life. I work with a lot of people who are grappling with that in my healing practice. But I think that there's something bigger going on here. That if we go back and zoom way out to what AI is reflecting, that we live in a culture that is not comfortable with uncertainty, that we live in a culture that needs to know, needs to feel in control, which is one of the hallmarks, right? If you look at white supremacy culture or colonizer culture, whatever you want to call it, it's one of the hallmarks of it. We need to be in control, have a sense of being in control because we live in an unsafe world. And one of the reasons we live in an unsafe world is that we have this acculturated or perceived lack of connection or superiority to the natural world. So there's this deep disconnection that lies at an even deeper level than the lack of safety. One of the ways that I've noticed in the past few weeks this kind of addictive energy isn't in what we would consider like a conventional addiction like alcohol or substances, but in the activity of the mind. So I'll just share really candidly that a few weeks ago I worked with and sat with the really powerful plant medicine ayahuasca. If you've known me for a while, you know that I have a history with this plant. The last time I sat with her was 12 years ago, and it was life changing. And this time, no less life changing, but I've done a lot of stuff since then, so I was able to navigate it more. And one of the things that she showed me was what my mind was doing. If you've ever worked with any kind of psychedelic, or even if not, you know that when you're on a journey, any kind of journey, in this case, it was a psychedelic journey, often we just don't really get to know where it's going next. That's definitely true in life. And in a psychedelic journey, it's just kind of heightened. And what I witnessed during this journey was my mind trying to control it, trying to steer it, trying to project what would happen next. And I felt that as an addictive energy, right? That there was an addiction within me and maybe within you and maybe within the culture to trying to get the mind to figure out what's going to happen next so that we can brace ourselves, so that we can prepare, so that we can assume the correct posture or interfere with it in some way, steer it in some way. So I was watching this happen and also noticing and recollecting that all of the most beautiful things in my life have come through surrender, have come through letting whatever wants to emerge, and then participating in it. And through that participation, guiding it, whether it's breath work, whether it is, like the conference that I spoke about a few weeks ago. And what allows that surrender to happen is very much a deep, fully felt sense of connection with our own roots, our own beingness, our own body, and then the wider world. Not in a way that's in any way superior, but as kinship. Kinship with trees, kinship with soil, kinship with ancestors and history. And that when we can feel that sense of connection, not just speak to it, not just read poems about it, which is something I will totally cop to. I will substitute reading a beautiful poem by Rumi with actually having that experience of connection. But when we can actually feel that sense of connection, surrender becomes possible, and we're able to move with the current of life instead of trying to control it, instead of being mired in this story that we're unsafe in the world, instead of being mired in that anxiety. Now, as I say that, I'm very much aware that many of us are not safe in the world, especially right now. And yet there's a distinction that I feel wanting to emerge. And I'm going to kind of ask for your grace in this because I'm just speaking in draft. Um, Between a situational lack of safety and a core lack of safety. A situational lack of safety is kind of what I had growing up. I was genuinely unsafe sometimes in my neighborhood growing up. I've been genuinely unsafe sometimes when traveling. And yet, and I'll use traveling as an example, often in those situations where I am objectively unsafe, there is a trust that comes in that whatever unfolds is exactly right. And that's the kind of safety, not in the situational sense, but in the larger sense of whatever unfolds, whatever happens in this moment and in each moment, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's tragic, even if it's incredibly painful, is exactly what's happening, for lack of a better word, which seems obvious, but I'm struggling with this. Can you tell? As I breathe and kind of let myself settle into this, what's coming to me or what I'm remembering is some of the training that I had in this practice called inner dance, which some of you have probably experienced with me. And it's a sound based practice where you're asked to surrender to rhythm, frequency, tones, overlapping and intermingling. And these rhythms, frequencies, and tones are at times during the experience actually designed to stimulate that part of our nervous system that gets activated when we're not safe. And the idea behind it is that if we, instead of becoming reactive to that, simply surrender to it, that we can befriend that impulse in us and actually cultivate that kind of sense of deeper safety that I'm in a stumbling way trying to get at. Something that came up in a client session the other day was simply the idea of taking time to be in relationship with the natural world, with other beings, natural beings, trees, squirrels, dogs, clouds, and just breathing with them. And as we kind of explored in that last episode, letting breath weave us back into connection so that we can cultivate that sense of safety, so that we can come back into the body and into the heart. And so those kind of addictive behaviors, whatever they might be, simply won't have the soil to grow. There's nothing for them to hook into. And it would be so interesting. And I think somebody's building this, just to go back to that idea where this started with AI, to build a language model based on only indigenous wisdom. Because at the core of so much of that, those stories, those ways of being, is a fundamental safety in the world, connection with the world, kinship with the world, community. And how that model might interact with folks, how that design might reflect back differently to people, and what might that reinforce. It's reminding me, and this is going to take us off on kind of like a skinny limb of the trunk of our conversation today. I was having a conversation once with a friend of mine who's an architect, and we were walking around Los Angeles, and I just had this moment where I was like, what if all the houses are square, essentially rectangles, some version of straight lines? And I went, well, what if the core design principle of architecture were circles instead? And he just kind of had to stop and sit down, because the implications of just the designed world around us being all straight edges is really different than one that would be in circles. The implications of working with AI that are trained on Western culture that is steeped in this perceived lack of safety, really different than one that's designed with a fundamental safety built in to the invisible threads of cultural narrative. Well, this one kind of went all over the place, friends. Thanks for sticking around for it. I'm really curious to listen back to this at some point and see what I actually said. And thanks, as always, for joining me in the field. And we'll see you again soon.